Hello and welcome to The Print. Today we have with us Dr. Swasti Rao, an Associate Fellow at the Europe and Eurasia Center at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Dr. Rao had recently tweeted a long thread on the rupee-ruble mechanism and the growth of yuan in trade between India and Russia. Good evening, ma'am. To start the conversation, my first question, you had, in your thread, on your Twitter thread, you had raised this issue of the unviability of the rupee-ruble mechanism. Would you explain to us why? Because, over the last year, especially since the war in Ukraine, India has started purchasing a lot more oil and other important products from Russia, usually paying in rupees, and we've had an ancient rupee-ruble mechanism since the Soviet Union days. So why do you say today that this has become non-viable, that has led to Russia requesting India to trade in the yuan or pay some part of the trade in the yuan?
Right. So, first of all, thank you for this conversation. And I think what you're referring to is basically, it was a Reuters story that recently came out, which was about India making payments for Russian oil in yuan, like you said. And what sort of took the strategic community or the commentators and analysts by a bit of surprise is because India would be very wary of making payments in yuan, basically letting China have this dominance over India's financial transactions. Okay, Chinese currency have this dominance because India is basically wary of a Chinese-led Asian order, financial order, and that's what it is. We have not joined the RCEP, we have not joined a whole host of things because we don't want to sort of give China that prominence. So I think one of the reasons why it became a little, so to say, it raised eyebrows and it raised a lot of triggered a lot of discussion is because how is this happening then? Why are we paying in yuan if at all? Now, couple of things happened, and the one thing is that I have been following this for a while because as part of my work, I'm writing a book on the impact of the war in Ukraine. So one of the things is definitely to do with economics, okay? And as you rightly said, Keshav, which is that the ballooning trade that you've seen between India and Russia is great for India. It's a great economic decision which has been made by India. Full marks to the Indian government for that, okay? But the problem is that it is a product of something of a geopolitical, so to say, war, right? It is not really a product of well etched out contracts where everything is basically arrived at with consensus, okay? Now the problem is that when we started out, that there is a background to sanctions. Now Russia has been perpetrated, or Russia, there have been thousands of sanctions imposed on Russia, and I would refer to the energy trade because out of all the revenues that Russia earns, energy revenues amount to about 40% of Russia's total revenue. So it's like a lot of money, for Russia. And after the sanctions, that Russia's half of foreign reserves were already frozen in banks, outside of Russia, and there were subsequently bans that were put on the oil trade that Europe was purchasing from Russia, and then eventually India started, to buy all that oil. So in 2022, the trade rose, and 2023, the trade is still very steady, and we are buying lots and lots of oil. But the problem is about payments. So initially, we wanted in 2022, we were very upbeat about a rupee-ruble mechanism working out. Now, there are primarily two reasons why this mechanism has not been able to work out. One is, like you said, is trade deficit. We are only buying all that oil from Russia, but we are not really selling it anything back. Okay, so there is a export-import imbalance. And right now, our trade deficit with Russia is to the tune of about 37% or so, which is second only to China, by the way. So it's massive. And despite all the political will on both sides, we have not been able to sell anything back to Russia. That's the one reason why rupee-ruble is not working. The other reason why it's not working is because there is an issue of convertibility. Okay, one problem is that ruble is not a fully convertible, currency. And partly the reason is that it's propped up by capital controls. Partly it's now, why is it being propped up by capital controls? Because there is a political statement there. Because somewhere Russia also wants to sort of signal to the world that sanctions are ineffective. And look how well our ruble is doing. So because of a mix of all these things together, the problem is that we have not been able to get through the rupee ruble mechanism, payment mechanism. Initially, we tried making a lot of payments in rupees, especially the oil trade was happening in dirhams, UAE's dirhams. But now the problem is that Russia is saying that, look, we can't be using all these rupees, because in the Indian banks, in our accounts, you have put all these rupees, but we can't convert them. Number one. Number two, even dirhams, we have reached some sort of a saturation point. Now you have to give us or make these payments in a currency that we can use, and the friendly currency that Russia calls is, of course, yuan. Okay. Now the point is that India does not want to pay in yuan, and that's why India has been paying in dirhams. But it's a bit of a catch-22. So it is a trade which is economically viable for India because of the discounts and a lot of free on board basis. It's free on board basis, but at the same time, because of the lack of arriving at a consensus as to how to resolve this problem, the problem is so to say happening.
Right, and like you mentioned, this happened because of a very specific geopolitical issue, which is the war in Ukraine, right? Insofar as the war in Ukraine has had an effect, say, on the larger security policy and economic policy that we see, how far has the war in Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions by the European Union and the US and its allies sort of pushed Russia towards the aegis of China, especially as yuan is now a friendly currency, right? And what does that also, in the larger sense, what is that impact with India-Russia is friendly alliance, given that we have a historic connection with them?
True. So it's a mix of so many questions. Let me take it up one by one. Let me take it, from the last one, which is that yes, India and Russia, we definitely share, I would say, a lot of affinity and historical affinity and all of that. I mean, I don't think there is a problem with respect to understanding that. But as far as other things are concerned, for example, the impact of the sanctions, you mentioned that. Now, I think even that is not understood well, is because what happens is that when the US, when the G7, when the collective West, okay, let's put it this way, when the collective West started to put these sanctions on Russia, they were never meant to work in the short term. To be honest, if you get into the literature of what the sanctions are meant to provide, the sanctions were never meant to provide that short term thing. It was always meant to provide a long term impact on the ability of Russian economy to perform, right? And I think the best way to look at it, and one of the ways in which I put it, is that if you look at what is happening long term, one is that the energy revenues are falling. Now the energy revenues are falling. It's a complicated thing. If you read my thread, you would know that it's the magic doesn't lie in the fact that Russia is able to export the same quantity of oil, because the objective of the price cap was always to maintain Russian oil supply in the world. Because imagine, Russia is such a massive supplier that if the supply was to disappear overnight, it would just create a frenzy in the global oil markets and the pricing as well. So the purpose was always to maintain Russian global supply as in of oil, so that the Europeans are able to reroute it. So it was a very selfish, kind of a decision, so that Europeans are able to reroute, number one. Number two, and Russia is not able to earn the same revenues. Okay. Now, the problem that happens, Keshav, is that when you are trying to understand if the sanctions had that impact, usually, see, the Russian war started in 2022. Right, 2022 February. But this particular sanction that I'm referring to came into effect on 5th of December 2022. And the second part of the sanction came into effect on 5th of February 23. So when you're looking at the revenues that are earned by Russia, and if you look at the total data of 2022, it doesn't tell you any picture, because the sanctions came into effect on 5th of December. So if you want to assess the impact of sanctions, you have to look at the data which is post December 2022, which is like the first quarter of 2023. And if you pick up the data for the first quarter of 2023, you see a steady decline. You see a steady decline of about 40%, 45% of loss of revenue, not just in the first quarter, but also in the first half, because now we are in July and data for January to June has also emerged. So there is a steady drop. Why is that drop happening? The drop is happening because, as everybody expected, that once China opens up, there will be a surge in the global prices, etc. That never happened. Number two, somewhere because of, that remains, basically the global demand remains low, and that has not been able to sort of push up the prices of oil. And you will be, I mean, I'm sure you know, but OPEC and Russia, OPEC plus basically, they already decided to cut down production a couple of times. Now they have decided to cut down supplies. But even then, that has not really led to that thing that they want, which is that, you know, a price up of the Urals, okay? That is not really happening. And if that happens, by whatever degree, then it is not really good news for India, because that makes it expensive for us to buy. So that is the first thing, that how should you assess the impact of the sanctions, especially energy, because we are referring to energy here. How do you assess the impact of energy sanctions on Russia? It is wrong to compare the data of 2022, because like I said, that it only makes sense when you start doing it from December 2022 onwards, and then you have the figures for 2023. The other problem why it is effective is because of the rising cost of the war. Now, according to certain estimates, last year the war costs were expected to be somewhere around, say, $900 million every day, and the war is still on. But if I look at certain data that emerged earlier this year, I mean, it says that it's already crossed like several trillion dollars. This is like 5 to 9, 7 trillion dollars. And this is not just the military cost, like of the war that is being fought at the battlefront. It is about everything. The amount of money that Russia is spending on its FSB, the amount of money which is Russia spending on its police, basically all of it, which is a byproduct of this war. So the rise in war cost is not a reason. And the third reason, I would say, how to assess the impact of the sanctions is by looking at the budget deficit. Now, Russia is not a country that runs a budget deficit. And that somewhere I pointed out in my thread also, that usually Russia is always in a budget surplus, because it has such massive reserves of hydrocarbons that, you know, even if they were to sell it all the time, they would still, earn money, no matter how many sanctions are there. But like I said, that they have reported a budget deficit. I was, in 2022 alone, 2022 figures, I mean, I've put it here for you. The budget deficit was about $47 billion, okay? In 2023, first 6 months only, the budget deficit is $42 billion, right? Now, what is Russia doing with it? Now, I mentioned it in my thread. What Russia is doing is that now Russia is selling the yuan to make for the shortfall in the budget deficit. Now, because Russia has a lot of, and that is one of the reasons why Russia wants us to pay in yuan, because all this energy trade will not be able to make sense for the falling deficit, for the money that they want to spend on the war, for all this, unless and until the money that they're getting from the energy trade, which is their cash cow, comes in yuan, or comes in a friendly currency. And even though, and this particular decision that was taken in Russia about selling a certain section of yuan, okay, for making up for the shortfall of their budget deficit, this came about in January. So from about 13th January to 6th February, it's out there in news, okay? So the Russian finance ministry actually announced that we are now going to be selling yuans so that we are able to get rubles, so that we are able to make up for this shortfall. So the point is that is how you understand why countries like India, who don't want to be identified publicly, I mean, I'm sure, about making payments in yuan, but they are still somewhere forced into or pressurized into, making those payments, because the situation in Russia domestically is not good. And these are the ways in which you find out about that. And just the last bit, because you mentioned the impact of the sanctions, is that if you look at, I mean, how do countries earn money? Of course, energy trade is one. The other trades are, that's one. And FDI is also an important, marker. So if you look at Russia's FDI status right from if you go to World Economic Forum reports, you will get the data from, say, 20 years or so. So for the first time with the war in Ukraine, this particular, the FDI status has dwindled at a historic low. So if you put all these things together, you understand that yes, the sanctions are not meant to, or they are not capable of stopping the war in the short term, or affecting Russia's ability to wage a war in the short term. But in the long term, this really means a lot of serious troubles for Russia, unless and until the Russian system proves to be resilient. And they are making efforts there. But since we were just mentioning that, I mean, I'm sure that's a different topic to be discussed as to what really is Russia doing for that. But these are the reasons why energy trade is not able to give up as many revenues. And I kind of missed that point. And one of the points that is not really discussed as much is that also there's a reason why Russia is not able to earn the same money from the same amount of oil. Like I said, that they have been able to reroute it, but they're not able to earn the same money that they were earning earlier. One of the reasons is that Russia's cost of extraction of per barrel of oil remains one of the highest in the world. And this is something that they probably, I feel that somewhere they should have tried to build that resilience into their oil industry, oil extraction. Because, for example, just for comparison, Saudi Arabia's per barrel cost of extraction is very, very low. This is about $10 to $12 to $15, right? I mean, I think about $12 or so, around that cost. But in Russia, it remains very, very high. Then there are different kinds of taxes that are very high in Russia because of the war in Ukraine. Okay, now everything put together, this is how the revenues fall, despite the fact that the flows are the same. Okay, but for India, I mean, for us, it's like a moment, and we are trying to capitalize as much as possible on the moment. I'm not sure if we will be able to continue with it, because just if you look at May to June imports, from May to June, the imports have gone down. Now, this has not gone down because there is a lack, or there's a absence of goodwill. All of that is there. The problem is with respect to Russia's own production cuts. Like they said that they have already done production cuts. Now they are going for supply cuts. Now, if Russia introduces 500,000 barrels of supply cuts from August, it is going to affect their imports, right? And for India, the point that I'm trying to convey is that this is something which is a short-term thing, unless and until the two governments sit together and put a framework to it. Put a more sustaining framework to it. So until the time a more sustaining framework comes into picture or into place, we will have these roadblocks. Somewhere the payment will become a problem. Somewhere Russia's production cuts will become a problem, because what happens in a contract? In a contract, you are bound by the terms of the contract. Here, there is nothing like that. It's ad hoc. So these are the problems that we need to tackle from our side.
Fair enough, and I think one of the larger sort of questions with the Russian focus on yuan, and like you pointed out, they were even selling yuan to make up this deficit, has led to sort of this political slogan of de-dollarization picking up steam, right? That this is the way that the global south can finally undo the Bretton Woods system. So how far has the Russia-Ukraine war and the subsequent actions exacerbated and supported this sort of de-dollarization? Is it something that people or economists and foreign policy makers need to look at seriously? Or is it rather that, like you mentioned, because of the war, this is sort of an ad hoc sort of system till the end of the war, and until and unless we see frameworks and actual structures, de-dollarization is a sentiment and not a policy?
Well, I would still stick to it, because you talk to any serious economist anywhere in the world and they'll tell you that de-dollarization is not happening. So the way I look at it is that we were discussing it earlier, which is that yes, it is a political sentiment. There is, I think, a lot of, I would say, that sentiment in the global south and a lot of non-West is to try and have a mechanism where their trade is unaffected in case there is a war that happens somewhere in the world that they have nothing to do with. Now, one of the arguments given for the war in Ukraine and India's, or not just India, so many countries' responses that, look, it's not our war. Why should we suffer? Why should our payments suffer? Why should our trade suffer? Why is it that we are undergoing a food, fuel, fertilizer crisis because of a war that we don't have a role into? And I think these are genuine concerns, okay? So, and economically, or like monetarily, I mean, they kind of translate into this desire on the part of the global south to try and invent or try and work out a parallel payment system, right? Some sort of a parallel mechanism, so that in case, because the way it's been happening, first it happened with Iran, right, when it affected India. And now it's happened with Russia. So somewhere, see, the loss of credibility or loss of trust, I think more than credibility, let's say trust, in dollar is I mean, I understand where it is coming from, because it's like if tomorrow you have a political problem with somebody and you suddenly decide to stop your trade with them, I mean, what are the other people going to do? There are so many middle order powers, and we don't, like I said, that we haven't triggered the war. So I think the discomfort is pretty justified, okay? But now when you try to implement it, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because no matter what, the point is that even if you look at the global transactions, or if you look at the amount of what currency is used as the global reserve currency, in both these two most important markers, I mean, I'm sure we can just go on talking about it if you are having a more technical discussion, but something that the viewers can also easily understand, because one of the things that we were discussing is that either it becomes too complicated for normal people to understand, or it becomes too rhetorical, okay? So I think if you want to find out a genuine middle ground, the problem is that one of the reasons is that, like I said, that the misgiving is justified, but when you try to implement it, you can't implement it, because the two main markers of global transactions and which currency do you hold your foreign reserves are both dominated by the dollar. In fact, if you look at the foreign reserve, that basket, I think the second is euro and the other G7 member currencies, and then there is a certain section of yuan. So in theory, you can argue that yes, there is de-dollarization if you look at the fringe so to say payments or something. As a plan B, I totally support it. I said yes, we must have some sort of plan B when something or the global events turn out the way they turned out this time with the Ukraine war. We must have something that should enable us to keep our trade moving. But having said that, to sort of equate it with saying that there is de-dollarization or dollar is going to lose its hegemony, or I think it's wishful thinking. And the more you think like that, I think the more incorrect you are in terms of understanding what is going on. I think if you just allow me to sort of remind everybody, or sort of mention this, that there was just so much sentiment around the BRICS currency, right? It looked as if this is the next big thing and everybody was talking about it. Of course, the economists knew that it won't work, but it was touted as almost like a patriotic, so to say, call, right? That yeah, we must stand against the hegemony of the West. Until and unless our foreign minister came and clarified all the doubts and said that, look, that's not on the cards, because we all know that BRICS economies are dominated by China, and we don't want to be a part of anything where the Chinese dominance is, kind of etched and by our help, okay? So we don't want that. So these are going to remain national, so to say, preoccupations, right? That's what he said, to be honest. So long story short, I think it's a good way to look at it in terms of a plan B. And somewhere in foreseeable or whatever future, some decades down the line, if the capital controls are removed from currencies like yuan and rubles, etc., you might find a bigger share of international transactions happening among them. But otherwise, it is an incorrect way of saying that yes, there is de-dollarization happening. It's not. Not just that, dirhams, like we are not paying in dollars, we are paying in dirhams, right? But dirhams are pegged to dollar. Even the Chinese yuan is pegged to dollar since the 90s. Okay, so there's a reason why they are pegged to dollar, because dollar is where you get the best convertibility, the liquidity, despite all other problems, like on a relative scale. Okay, so these kind of things are where I feel that the de-dollarization things kind of runs into a lot of confusions, okay, between the political sentiment and the economic viability.
Fair. So, and I mean, talking about this, and you like how the External Affairs Minister pointed out that we would not want to be part of any system that is dominated by China. So, but this is something that has been happening in the larger sphere, where you see sort of allies wanting to create resilience with allies, or this idea of friendshoring. That's what the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called it, friendshoring, and this idea of carving out those sort of individual countries we can work with for supply chain resilience, right? How far does friendshoring work insofar as generating global trade, or is it sort of creating a fragmented geoeconomic situation, which then we'll see in the future countries like India, trying to maintain both relation with China, a relation with the US, a relation with Russia? How far has this current geopolitical moment led to sort of geoeconomic fragmentation? And to just add to that, my last sort of question to that is, where would you see Russia playing its role here, given its war in Ukraine, given its sudden friendly closeness with China, trading in the yuan, right? Where then do you see this playing out, and where do you see India's position in this larger conversation?
It's a very interesting question, and just to try to sort of simplify it, because it's a lot of very complicated terms at the same time. I think it just didn't start with the war. It started with COVID. Okay, the fact that you have to sort of go beyond or transcend this classic cowboy capitalism, this classic neoliberal honeymoon, okay, of global trade, where if a trade route or a trade mechanism is resilient, resilient in the sense if it's cost effective, then you go for it, okay. I think COVID also showed that this is not going to work, and then the war in Ukraine kind of reiterated it in a completely new light, okay. In my opinion, in short, I think the trusted connections between countries that trust each other, they will arrive a little later. It's a work in progress. Let's understand that. We are all trying to do that because we understand that trade needs to be done among trusted partners. If you look at all the trade, so to say, all these policy, so to say, these issues are actually embedded in a lot of these economic programs that the European Union, for instance, or the West is now coming up with, or Japan is coming up with, where just this plain think of a profit loss motive is not going to work. And to put it shortly, I mean, to put it simply, I genuinely feel that we will see a lot more fragmentation before we actually arrive at, this rather equilibrium of having trusted partners here and there. And part of that disturbance also comes from the fact that we are living in a lot of geopolitical ambivalence, okay. Like on the one hand, there is a Ukraine war going on. I mean, India is not siding with anybody in the war, but at the same time, India is one of the beneficiaries of, one of the byproducts of this war, which is the oil trade. Now, in what category are you going to put it, right? So for sure, the first thing that we need to understand is that though it makes sometimes, as in a lot of headlines, to talk in binaries and say that yes, there's fragmentation and now we're moving to more trusted connections, I think it's like a lot of gray zone in between, and all these things are a work in progress. That's the one thing. Just with particular reference to the war in Ukraine, like I've been maintaining for a long time, because the war has been going on for such a long time, is that regardless of the outcome of the war, Russia is likely to get further pushed into China's lap in different ways, not just the trade, the energy trade, or this, but in terms of different ways, because who else is going to make up for that shortfall? The technological, all the technological, so to say, the it's being cut off from the West for all the technological things, the FDIs, who's going to make, compensate for that shortfall? So I think China remains to be the most, so to say, promising actor there. Of course, like I said, if you want to put India there, then of course we have to work out certain structural mechanisms for us, for our trade to take off, for some sort of an investment that happens back in India, etc. So, but we are still far from that. It's not happening. That's one of the reasons why the remaining S-400s could not come. So far more important than the oil were those two weapon systems, right? Because it's 42,000 crore deal that we had with Russia. And till the time the Indian Air Force did not cut down its budget on the procurement, okay, for this, we always used to think that it's Western propaganda. I mean, that was the common thing, that Russia is going to live up to its promises. The point is that even though Russia wants to, the point is that the current situation is such that they can't really have more rupees. They want to make those payments. So anyway, long story short, I think I want to sort of reiterate the main thing, which is that let's not try to find these very quick answers in terms of binaries, that yes, now there is fragmentation and now we are moving to a different stage. Yes, cowboy capitalism will not work. So many people have talked about it. I think Minister Jaishankar calls it the Nagoya model of management, where everything was very cost effective and etc. He said that no, you have to build trust into your supply chains, into your production chains, etc. One of the major areas where this is happening is the semiconductors, so the world is already moving into that direction. That's one. The other thing which makes me a little, not a little, but quite optimistic on this, is that also there is a lot of effort for the like-minded countries to come together when it comes to critical and emerging tech. And slowly we have to understand that from the global security order and the global geo-economic order, the global economic order, where we are going is the global digital order. So whoever has that share in that pie, who has the largest share in that global digital order, is actually going to determine or actually going to rule both the security order as well as the economic order. So I think when you see like that, and when you see the like-minded countries going together, like all the ISET thing that we just had with US, then you start to understand that we are indeed moving to a completely different zone. But that doesn't by itself solve the problems that we have today. So like I said, that the gray zone is going to linger for a while, and I think the best we can do is to keep our options open with a lot of pragmatism. So I think just the biggest key takeaway that I often say is that that pragmatic realism should always be, that mode should always be on, that yeah, these are our options, and this is how we can best do it. And to a lot of extent, I would say India's handling of the war, like war and all the choices that it and the pressures it puts on India, I think we've done it pretty well.
Thank you again, ma'am, for having this engaging conversation with us, covering quite a few different topics, from the war in Ukraine to the yuan trade to this idea of geoeconomic fragmentation. So on that note, thank you again. Thank you for tuning in to The Print today.
Thank you, Keshav. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.